Tauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. About 60 people were arrested in San Francisco, US after protesting President Trump's immigration raids. Meanwhile, National Guard troops hit Los Angeles streets as immigration protests enter a third day, sparking more arrests after at least 10 detained on Sunday. Trump is expected to hold talks with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, according to the White House official. Meanwhile, Israeli intercepts an aid vessel carrying Greta Thunberg and 11 others heading to Gaza. All aboard are safe as the UN urges more boats to challenge the blockade. France demands their return and Turkey slams Israel's move. Tehran warns it will scale back cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog if an anti-Iran resolution is passed this week. The IAEA should not expect friendly cooperation, says an atomic energy spokesman ahead of Monday's board meeting. President Trump's new travel ban takes effect Monday, blocking entry from 12 countries, mostly in Africa and the Middle East, to protect national security. The order also imposes partial restrictions on 7 more countries, though exemptions apply for diplomats, athletes, and certain work visas. Tehran has slammed Israel's interception of a Gaza-bound aid vessel as piracy, saying the incident occurred in international waters. Iran's foreign ministry called the raid an assault on international activists and a violation of global law. NATO chief Mark Rutte is urging a 400% increase in air and missile defenses, warning that Russia's air attacks in Ukraine show the need for stronger protection. He says NATO also needs thousands more tanks and millions of artillery shells to meet modern threats. US-China trade talks are underway in London, focusing on rare earths, tech, and tariff cuts amid a 90-day truce. Led by top officials, the talks follow tensions over export rules and aim to ease friction and boost global stability. Tensions in Los Angeles appear to be easing after 3 straight days of unrest over immigration raids. Overnight, the protests that had gripped downtown LA grew calmer, according to our correspondent on the ground. Mayor Karen Bass has urged protesters to avoid violence and chaos. On Sunday, cars were set on fire and a British photographer was injured, shot with a sponge bullet, requiring surgery. The unrest has given current President Donald Trump a new opening to push his tough law and order agenda. He has deployed the National Guard, overriding the wishes of California Governor Gavin Newsom. North American correspondent Anthony Zutcher reports that Trump is using the violence to justify a crackdown on left-wing unrest. As calm returns to the streets, the political fallout is just beginning. We now know that also in San Francisco, there was arrest of 50 people during the protests, and now US has other states following the suit of protests as the protest that had grappled downtown LA grew calmer in LA, but it's growing further to the rest of the states. However, according to our correspondent on the ground, Mayor Karen Bass has urged protesters to... Now we have guests joining us, Spencer Clitchery He's a communication strategist. He's joining us live from California. Thank you for joining us today. How do you interpret the political message behind President Trump's decision to deploy the National Guard to LA without governor's request?
Well, this is of a piece with Trump's essentially authoritarian nature and his organized effort to make himself an autocratic leader in what is supposed to be a democracy. Of course, law and order needs to be preserved. Local authorities are very well trained and equipped to do that, and the governor and local city and county level authorities are completely familiar with the procedure for calling out the National Guard if they need to do that. That's not at all what this is about. Trump, once again, is trying to make Americans panic about a so-called invasion of foreigners. The point of that has nothing to do with protecting Americans and everything to do with exploiting fear in order to justify his seizure of power. You know, this is typical with authoritarians. They select one or two groups who are supposedly an existential threat to the nation or to the religion or whatever the excuse is, and use that to mobilize people behind them and to justify the termination of normal democratic rights. I often think of the transaction involved here as, from the authoritarian's point of view, you get feelings and I get power. In other words, I fire up your passions over nationalism or over religion or just general fear and hatred, and while you get to enjoy those feelings, I get to seize power.
And how do you respond to critics who say Democratic leaders have been slow or ineffective in communicating a coherent stance on immigration enforcement and protest management?
I think generally speaking that's true. I think the Democratic Party is in a very serious state in terms of just what it stands for. I'm writing about this now. I'm actually working on a book which I'm calling The Liberal Backbone, addressing the question of what happened to the liberal backbone, because while Democrats do have a strong set of values, which include respect for human rights and basic human compassion, they seem to have lost the ability to communicate those values clearly. Democrats have been shying away from the immigration issue, not all of them, but too many of them, because they feel the polling is bad for them on immigration. And they don't seem to understand that what people really want is a leader or leaders who will actually stand up for what they believe in, first of all, whatever it is that they do believe in. But if you're running away from bad poll numbers, you're showing exactly the opposite.
And how can, building on what you said, how can Democratic leaders balance supporting peaceful protest while distancing themselves from violent elements that emerged during these past 3 days demonstrations?
Well, one sign of hope is I think there has been quite a lot of clarity from Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, from California Governor Gavin Newsom, from local Democratic members of Congress who represent that area, from local community leaders within the particular neighborhoods. They've been basically unanimous in saying that violence is wrong. Protest is a sacred constitutional right in the United States as long as it's peaceful. So peaceful protesters must be protected. But there's no justification for throwing rocks at police or setting cars on fire, which a minority of the protesters have been doing. So I think this is actually a good sign that there has been clarity from the top down in the state of California about this. I would note that those protesters who are throwing rocks and lighting fires and that sort of thing, very often those people come from outside. I have some direct experience of this in my work, and unfortunately you get these ideologues or just basically people playing dress up as revolutionaries for the weekend, and they do enormous damage. And if they wanted Donald Trump to succeed, they could hardly do better than by doing things like throwing rocks at police and lighting things on fire.
And on a related note, the optics of ICE raids followed by military presence in a sanctuary city are stark, and how should Democrats frame this to resonate with both immigrant communities and moderate voters?
Well, again, if you know what you stand for, you don't have to tailor your message for different audiences. And this is a big part of the problem with Democrats these days, is they try to figure out how can we say something to immigrants? How can we say something to people who are worried about immigration? How can we say something to all of these different audiences? But if you actually know what you stand for, it becomes much simpler, and you can communicate with multiple audiences because ultimately people respect the fact that you actually do have values. And Democrats are on the right side of this issue, not just from the point of view of compassion and respect for rights, but in terms of what's effective in law enforcement and maintaining the peace. Again, I have quite a lot of experience of this because I've consulted with police departments in my communications function, including one that had to deal with large-scale protests and some very serious challenges, but was an excellent department, not only compassionate, but also very effective at dealing with crime. And what works is not to roll out with your armored vehicles and making these displays of force with what look like soldiers, and some of them are soldiers, members of the National Guard, in some cases posing with military-style weapons. This is exactly what you don't do. You must be ready to respond with force if you need to, but making these visible displays of it is provocative, excuse me, and makes things worse. Of course, that is Donald Trump's objective, is to provoke exactly the disorder that we did see over the weekend. And this is not just my opinion, though, about what actually does work. This has been shown through research over decades now, and I've seen it happen myself, where violent crime problems go down dramatically when you know how to follow current thinking in law enforcement. So as I say, this is not just a question of Democrats, being softer than Republicans in terms of whether or not they want to beat protesters over the head. This is a question of what actually works.
And Spencer, that brings us to this critical question that what communication tactics would you recommend for countering the administration's framing of these protests as lawlessness rather than civil resistance? Do you think the criticism of Governor Newsom for allegedly losing control of the situation holds merit?
They had not lost control of the situation. There was some violence on the first day of protests near the Home Depot in the city of Paramount, for example. But it's nothing that's beyond the ability of local law enforcement to deal with. It started to escalate when Donald Trump started talking about sending in the National Guard, and then when he actually did. That provides an opportunity for the people who do want to create disorder in the streets. That starts to draw in these outsiders and these other folks who don't necessarily, I don't believe, actually care all that much about what happens to the local people, but who see it as an opportunity to just advance their particular ideological agenda, or as I say, have a weekend pretending to be revolutionaries and then go home and leave folks to have to continue to deal with the actual situation on the ground. I think that the correct approach is the one that we are seeing so far from Mayor Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom, which is to emphasize that, yes, it is wrong to commit violent acts in the course of a protest, and we will find you, and arrest you, and you will have to face the justice system if you do that. And at the same time, it's very clear what Donald Trump is doing here. This is about him and seizing authoritarian power for himself. This has nothing to do with solving any problems with immigration or maintaining the peace. In fact, precisely the opposite. It serves his advantages the more disorder there is, because again, this is the excuse authoritarians always use to step in and justify taking away people's rights, because they need to have an emergency to justify that, and they will create the emergency if one doesn't already exist.
Thank you very much, Spencer Critchley, for joining us and bringing your expertise and sharing that with our audience. Now we move on to our next story. China and the United States have begun a fresh round of trade talks in London as both sides work to stabilize a fragile truce following months of escalating tariffs. The negotiations are taking place at the historic Lancaster House with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng leading Beijing's delegation. On the U.S. side, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer are leading the talks. President Donald Trump's press secretary said that the U.S. is committed to seeing China follow through on the agreement reached in Geneva last month. Although the UK is not taking part in these talks, British officials have welcomed the dialogue, reiterating their support for free trade and warning that trade wars benefit nobody. The London talks come just days after President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping held their first official phone call since Trump's return to office. She said steering the big ship of U.S.-China relations in the right direction is vital. One major issue on the table is China's restrictions of rare earth exports, which are critical for EV batteries and other advanced technologies. U.S. officials want those shipments restored, while Beijing is pushing for relief on U.S. immigration curbs and access to high-end tech markets. Tensions flared in April when Trump imposed heavy tariffs, some as high as 145% on Chinese goods. China responded with countermeasures of up to 125%. A temporary 90-day tariff reduction was agreed in Geneva, but key disputes remain. China's export data for May shows a 12.7% drop in shipments to the U.S., underscoring the strain in trade relations. Now we have guest Ross Feingold. He's a political and risk analyst. He's joining us live from Taipei. Thank you for Ross for joining us today. How significant is the recent phone call between President Trump and Xi Jinping in the broader content of U.S.-China trade war?
Certainly, it shows that the two leaders, President Trump and Xi Jinping, they want to reach some kind of deal. There are a lot of people in the United States who think that the U.S. should completely decouple from China. However, it doesn't seem that that's what Trump wants. Trump wants high-tech manufacturing to be done in the United States. He's talked a lot about semiconductors. He's talked about iPhones. But I think for some of the cheaper products, low-cost products, whether that's toys or clothes or shoes, I think Trump is okay with those products being manufactured in China and exported to the United States, but subject to some conditions. And those conditions are that U.S. products are able to enter the China market at the same low tariffs that China products have entered the U.S. market, and those non-tariff barriers that have made it difficult for U.S. companies to do business in China are eliminated. So by having the phone call, I think President Trump sent a signal that he wants the United States to do business with China, but he wants it to be fair, and that the two sides need to talk and achieve that goal.
And building on, given the mixed signals since the tentative Geneva deal, what are the realistic chances that the London talks will lead to a durable de-escalation of the trade tensions between China and U.S.?
Certainly, Trump's comments following the phone call with Xi Jinping were positive, and I think that is really a message to his negotiating team, who are negotiating as we speak with the Chinese side, that they want to have some kind of positive outcomes from these trade talks. So again, I think the negotiators, the message they're giving to China is that the U.S. market is available. It is open to goods manufactured in China, but there are some issues that need to be addressed, and that includes the access that U.S. products have to the Chinese market.
And how might the leadership and negotiation styles of the U.S. delegation led by Treasury Secretary and Commerce Secretary Lutnick and the Chinese delegation led by Vice Premier He Lifeng influence this outcome?
That's a very good question. Certainly, the negotiating styles are very different. Secretary of Commerce Lutnick, who's part of the delegation, he's a very direct person. That's typically not the style that Chinese negotiators would use when engaging with another country. They tend to be more indirect, which actually makes the negotiations more protracted. So I think in this negotiation, the U.S. side is going to make very clear what its expectations are from the Chinese side, and then it's going to be up to the Chinese side to accept that or to not accept it, which might further damage the trade relationship between the two countries.
And some analysts argue that Trump's trade war tactics have hurt U.S. businesses and investors. Do you see any evidence that either side has softened their stance due to economic pressures?
I think President Trump is sending a signal that he's okay with imports from China into the U.S., especially when it comes to low-cost goods. He wants to keep inflation down. He doesn't want his supporters having to spend more money when they go shopping. And I think Trump is very attuned to that. So he sent this signal to his team. From his recollection, it was a positive phone call with Xi Jinping. So now it's up to the negotiating teams to put that vision into practice. But ultimately, the Chinese side will have to make some concessions to satisfy the U.S. side.
Thank you very much, Ross Feingold, for bringing your expertise to our conversation today. Now we move on to our next story. India, Poland, and Hungary are set to mark their return to human space flight with the launch of Axiom Mission 4. Scheduled for June 10th from NASA's Kennedy Space Center, the crew will travel aboard a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft, heading to the International Space Station for a 14-day mission. This will be the first government-sponsored human spaceflight for India, Poland, and Hungary in over 4 decades, and the first time any of them will send astronauts to the ISS together. The multinational AX-4 crew includes Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla of India, Slavoj Uznansky Wisniewski of Poland, Tibor Kapu of Hungary, and Peggy Winston, who had served as a commander on the Axiom Mission 2. The Dragon spacecraft will be making its debut flight, while the Falcon 9 booster has flown once before. After stage separation, the booster will attempt a landing at Cape Canaveral. Over the course of their stay, the crew will carry out more than 60 experiments focusing on human health, Earth monitoring, and material sciences. Now we have guest Dr. Surinder Pal. He's a former director of Indian Space Research Organization. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. What does India's participation in Axiom Mission 4 signify for the country's human space flight ambitions, especially since this is the first government-sponsored mission in over 4 decades?
Yeah, I know. I mean, it has got a lot of significance as far as India is concerned, India's space program is concerned. We have got a human space program, which is, called Gaganyaan, and we are going to have some flight without the astronauts and with the astronauts later on. Group Captain Shukla is one of the astronauts which have been chosen, for the Gaganyaan, and his experience in Axiom 4 will give a lot of inputs for our Gaganyaan mission, where 2 to 3 astronauts will be there. We call them Vyomnauts, Vyom Sastri. Vyom is the sky for us in Sanskrit. So this is after, early in 1984, Squadron Leader on Wing Commander Rakesh Sharma went into the Soyuz 6 on the Russian spacecraft, and most of the inputs which were there at that time, they are no longer relevant, because both the environments and ambiences are different, the spacecraft were different, and our Gaganyaan is almost it's an evolution of most of the things which have been done around the world, and it's the latest thing which we are doing. So inputs which will be coming from the personal experience by Group Captain Shukla will be quite useful. Second, as you said, there are 60 experiments. Out of the 60 experiments, 16 experiments are probably from India and I mean, from ISRO and various laboratories in the country. So that also will give a flip to our research. What molecules can be made? How zero gravity experiments can be done in the future? So it's a big, remarkable achievement which will be taking place once we have got a successful flight on XM4. And it's a 14 days flight. It's not a very long flight. So in that region, but 16 experiments which will be giving a lot of good inputs. And under microgravity, many molecules are produced, they can be made. And as far as like I understand, there's something will be about cancer research, about some cells to be, cells to be grown there, and some medical experiments will be done. Some medicine molecules will be tested on the cancers, etc., which can be done much faster there. So it's a big achievement as and when we get the results after the launch.
And
Thank you.
Doctor, how does this mission compare with India's previous human spaceflight efforts, such as the Gaganyaan program, in terms of scale and objectives?
See, if you are talking about 1984, then we can't compare it. 1984 was an experiment, and he went as an astronaut. Okay, not much of an experiment. In this particular case, Group Captain Shukla is going as I think he'll be piloting also. See, Peggy is the commander, and she'll be the pilot. So his experience will be used in Gaganyaan, and all the other things which are being done there may be repeated or will be repeated in Gaganyaan experiment also for zero gravity, etc. It's a 14 days mission. Gaganyaan will be a shorter mission, but all the experiences will be useful, and there will be a person who will be involved in Gaganyaan also, who is flying now. So it will be quite useful, and it will be a step in the right direction. Thank you.
And Doctor, what impact do you think this mission will have on inspiring the next generation of Indian scientists and engineers in space research?
Well, it's I cannot describe it in words. It will be unimaginable. I mean, I go to the various colleges, schools, etc., and I find that the students, youngsters are getting interested in space research. And not only this, the persons who are coming from college, they want to do some startups in the arena of space technology. So particularly this will make, many youngsters would like to fly, they will like to become astronauts, and in the future missions, they will plan or they will dream of going to moon and other places. So the dreams are very big in India. Indians dream quite a large dreams, they will have it, and they try to fulfill them also. So it will definitely encourage, inspire the younger generation, and Group Captain Shukla will be a role model. Like Squadron Leader Rakesh Sharma was a role model in the 80s and 90s. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Surendra Par, for bringing your expertise and sharing your insights with us today. Well, that's all we have time for. We will